I can't be more thrilled, because we've tried to get him in the past, to have him join us today. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, everybody. It's a privilege to speak with you today on such an important topic in our profession. I'm going to talk about 3 points, make 3 points today. Number one, a little bit about my background and my story. Number two, some of the mental health problems that confront our profession and some of the causes. And number three, some solutions that we all can benefit from. Finally, after my talk, we're going to show an original documentary that was really produced by the Erie County Bar Foundation and the New York State Lawyers Assistance Trust. So I welcome you to stay for that. It's about 25 minutes long, and it features lawyers, a judge, a law student, and national experts that we interviewed around the country on this important topic. I'm presently 56 years old. When I was about 40 or so, I was managing partner of a mid-sized litigation firm. And it was, as you can imagine, anybody who does litigation of any kind, a very stressful job. Not only did I have to juggle depositions, trials, and travel, but I had to also manage the law firm. And I, like most of you, handled stress pretty well, or so I thought. And I just accepted stress as part of the deal for becoming a lawyer, as most of us do. But something happened when I turned about 40, and it was pretty dramatic. I started having problems with sleep. My sleep became very fragmented. I was tired all the time. I was having difficulty concentrating at work. Things that used to make me happy brought me no joy anymore. When I was on vacation with my family, nothing. But one of the most pronounced experiences I had was with sadness, okay? And I didn't really understand it at the time, but I found myself crying a lot. Crying behind my office door, or driving home, I would look for an empty parking lot to pull aside and to cry by myself. And it might go on for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and for no particular reason. I knew something was wrong because this experience was so dramatically different from times I had cried in the past, and I hadn't cried a lot over my lifetime, but when my mother died, I cried tears of grief, and that was cathartic. That felt relieving. However, with this type of sadness and these types of tears, there was nothing cathartic about it. Crying begat more crying. It seemed senseless. I didn't feel better after I'd finished crying. I saw a psychologist. We met for a few times. Things were not getting better. They were getting worse. So I was struggling at that time to figure out what's wrong with me. You know, as lawyers, we're good problem solvers. And I had so many things going on inside of my head. Could this be burnout or too much stress? Could it be grief? Could it be just my frustration? Or sometimes, as we all do as lawyers, we get aggravated and mad, and maybe it was all taking a toll on me. So my therapist said, what's going on here is something more significant than that. What you're struggling with, I believe, is clinical depression. Now, like all of you, I'm an educated person. I thought I understood what that generally meant, but come to find out, I really didn't. I really didn't. And like most people, I confused in my head sadness and depression, all right? There's a big difference between the two. And one psychologist I read put it this way: we confuse depression, sadness, and grief. However, the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. The ability to experience the full range of emotions, including happiness, excitement, sadness, and grief. It's not sadness or grief, it's an illness. And that encapsulated what I was to find out, that it wasn't some passing bummer or the blues or being sad. It was really an illness. And that took me a long time to understand it and accept it and get treatment for it. Now, I eventually went to that psychiatrist. I explained my symptoms, and he explained to me how he diagnosed me, what kind of things make up depression. And there's a list of them, okay? You don't have to have all of them. It's not like checking off each item. But you have to have 4 or 5 of them, and they're thought of as clusters of symptoms. And they affect your body and your mind, and I would say in some regards your soul, everything about you as a human being. And there can be a range from mild to moderate to severe depression, okay? So he gave me some good advice. I left with some medication prescriptions, and I started my course of treatment. One thing he said to me that never left me, he said, Dan, you're not alone. There are millions of other people like you. And I was to find out later how many millions he was talking about. Currently, there's 350 million people in the world that suffer from depression. To get a sense of that, you'd have to take the entire population of the United States and Australia to come up with 350 million people. So it's an enormous global problem. In the United States, there's about 20 million people who currently have depression in every given year. And to give you an idea of that, that would equate to filling Ralph Wilson Stadium, where the Bills play, 250 times. 250 times to give you that many people. So a lot of people are in that boat. Now, how about we take it to the legal profession? There was a 2016 study that was just released. They studied 12,000 lawyers. They surveyed them. And what they came up was shocking to a lot of people. Maybe not surprising for those of us who practice law, but surprising to the researchers. They found that of those studied, 12,000 lawyers from 15 different states, 23 self-reported extremely high levels of stress. 19% reported symptoms consistent with clinical anxiety. That's about double the national average. Depression. 28% of them were found to have some problem with depression from mild to moderate to severe. That's almost 4 times the national average. Suicidal ideation, almost 12%. That's 5 times the national average. To give you some idea of the magnitude of the problem in our profession, 365,000 lawyers are suffering with depression right now. That's out of the 1.2 million lawyers in this country. That's the equivalent size of the population of the city of Pittsburgh. What causes all these problems? Why are lawyers so much more prone to depression and anxiety and mental health problems? I like to say it's like a perfect storm. You know, if any of you remember the movie or the book, it's about this ship that goes out into the ocean and is met with hurricane-force waves and sinks. But there are many different things that kind of coalesced at the same time that created the perfect storm. And for each person, those elements are different. But the ones I've identified are the following for depression. Genetics. There's a strong genetic component for people with depression. As many as 50% of people with depression are found to have a genetic history of depression somewhere in their family of origin. Early loss and trauma. What happens is, as we're young people, our brains are met with, if they're met with some kind of trauma, it has significant effects on brain structure and growth and can result later on in adult onset depression, which it did with me. Personality, I'm going to talk about that more closely, and the stress of being a lawyer. Let's talk about personality a little bit. I think this describes most lawyers that I practiced with and that I know, to some degree or another. They tend to be type A personalities. They're highly ambitious, overachieving, prone to perfectionism, and they're prone to pessimism. Now, when we talk about pessimism, what are we talking about? We're not talking about someone seeing the glass half full or the glass half empty. What we're talking about is a way of explaining the world. So lawyers as a whole tend to be a negative bunch. We tend to find problems everywhere, even outside the courtroom. I remember my wife saying, that I was a grumpy person a lot of the time. I didn't think of myself as a grumpy person a lot of the time, but she could see how it'd bring those problems home with me all the time, because there's a carryover for most lawyers from their work life to their home life to their personal life. So, one psychologist had a chapter in a book called Why Are Lawyers So Unhappy? And he looked at the issue of depression in the law. And this is what he said about pessimism. Pessimism is seen as a plus among lawyers because seeing troubles as pervasive and permanent is a component of what the law profession deems prudence. A prudent perspective enables a good lawyer to see every conceivable snare and catastrophe that might occur in any transaction. The ability to anticipate the whole range of problems and betrayals that non-lawyers are blind to is highly adaptive for the practicing lawyer, who can, by so doing, help his clients defend against these far-fetched eventualities. If you don't have this prudence to begin with, law school will teach it to you. Remember that phrase, you're going to learn to think like a lawyer? Unfortunately, though, a trait that makes you good at your profession does not always make you a happy human being. And I remember I would train young associates about the courtroom or about depositions, and I'd say, whenever I'd walk into a courtroom or a deposition, I instinctively scanned it for negative things. The judge looking at me a certain way, maybe he's going to be angry, maybe he's going to give me a hard time. A deposition, I'd meet the opposing counsel maybe for the first time. She wouldn't shake my hand. So these kind of things that we're talking about. Okay. The other element I talked about is stress. Now, stress for most of us is a good thing, right? It gets us motivated, concentrates us. It's really, the problem is too much stress, all right? It's not just enough stress, it's not chronic stress, it's perpetual stress. So we really never get a break, even when we're on vacation, from stress as lawyers. Now, I've identified a few components of it: fight or flight, the adversarial nature of the profession, winners and losers, time crunch, and little time for self-care. I've traveled around the country at law schools and speaking before lawyer organizations, and overwhelming majority of them could identify with every one of these things. So many of them take so little time or feel they don't have time to take care of themselves. So what happens? The biggest demon in the room is what happens to our bodies when our fight and flight response is constantly triggered. Really, our bodies are no different than that of our ancestors from tens of thousands of years ago. We share the same genetic makeup. We have the same nervous system, the same kind of body. So the fight or flight process in us was designed by nature to protect us for our own survival. So it's a very, very good thing. So when that kicks in, when we're fighting or fleeing, our body instinctively dumps large amounts of adrenaline and a hormone known as cortisol into our bodies to prepare us to do battle or to prepare us to run away, okay? The problem is, we as lawyers aren't chased by saber-toothed tigers. We're not chased by woolly mammoths, but we're in confrontational situations much of the time with judges, other lawyers, with clients, And interestingly, they've studied this, it triggers the same fight or flight cascading of hormones and neurochemicals that our ancestors experienced. Okay? So it's not an actual physical threat, it's a psychological threat. But our brains don't care. They react the same way. So the problem is we don't get out of our systems, as our ancestors did, those buildup of hormones and chemicals. They kind of stew inside of us, right? As they do for many lawyers. That has profound effects on the human body and the human brain, and ultimately there's a strong connection between that and mood disorders, including anxiety and depression. Stigma. I end up talking a lot about this as well because so many people in general, not just lawyers, let's start with people in general, feel ashamed of having a mental health problem, particularly depression because they see it as a sign of weakness, they feel defective, they feel like losers, they would just die if other people found out about them. Double down for lawyers, right? Lawyers are supposed to be like supermen. We're problem solvers. We don't have problems. One time I was told by a senior lawyer, he was calling me about a younger lawyer who had depression. You know, the old adage, if it's too hot, get out of the kitchen. He was supposed to, man up. He was supposed to pull himself up by his bootstraps. So the problem with that type of thinking, the problem with that type of stigma, it often prevents people from getting the help they need. Now, there's three different aspects to it. One is on the job, right? So after I got some treatment, I had to take about a month or two off from work. I came back on the job and explained to my partners what was going on with me, that this wasn't some simple thing that was going to be over in a few weeks. So as I was talking to them, they had three reactions. Three partners had three different reactions. The first was, what the hell's wrong with you? Go on a vacation, sort of thing. He was really upset and really angry at me, and I think that's typical of the type of reaction some people with depression may meet. That old kind of like, it's your fault. It's your fault. If only you were more grateful, if only you appreciated the good things in your life, you wouldn't feel this way. The second partner, complete silence. I had no idea what he was thinking. No idea. And that's common as well. People don't know what to say. They have no reference point for what depression is, so they stay silent. The third partner was kind of like an NBC News anchor. You know, he had perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect teeth. And he was smiling as I was telling him what was going on, which was kind of disjointed with what I was telling him. And he said, you know, Dan, you at 90%, no problem, better than any lawyer I know. And what he was doing, he was minimizing the problem, kind of shuffling it under the rug. Because he thought that by doing that, the problem would just go away. But this is no little problem. This is a big problem. And what I didn't appreciate at the time is that all three of them didn't have a reference point for what depression was. Next, the family. The family, lots of people don't feel that they can tell their family members, their wives, their children, their mother, their father. When I first told my wife about my diagnosis, the first thing she said is, "Are you having an affair?" I didn't understand what she was talking about. I said, "Of course not. Why would you say that?" And I think it's common for people who hear this from a sufferer to assume that it's their fault. You know, a spouse often interprets what you're saying as you're unhappy, you're dissatisfied. You must be dissatisfied with them. But that's not what it's about at all, and it took a long time for my wife to understand. She also did not have a reference point for depression. And finally, with myself, getting back to this idea that many people with depression feel ashamed, and that prevents them from getting treatment. Now, what can we do about it? There's 5 things I'd like to touch on. First is counseling. Some people are more apt to do that, and some people are more apt to go the medication route, and some people do both. But it's clear that counseling is a powerful antidote to depression. It gives you insight, as it did for me, what depression actually is. It's not sadness, right? Challenges negative thinking. Depression is made up of negative, ruminative, self-attacking thinking. And if you're walking around all day thinking like that, no one's challenging it, right? You just believe it's true. So you need somebody in your corner working with you, challenging that level of thinking, and then learning new coping skills. You know, I came to find out that I didn't have very many good coping skills. I didn't exercise very much. I drank coffee. I probably drank 7 or 8 cups of coffee a day. Really poor anger management skills. So I had a lot to learn, and I learned that in therapy. Support groups. 10 years ago, I started a support group for lawyers with depression. It meets every week and has met every week for 10 years. It's been a big success and provided help, I think, to hundreds of lawyers in Erie County. And the power of it is, when you're suffering with depression, you feel very alone. I'm the only one, right? You don't know that there's tens of millions of other people like you out there, right? So it combats that feeling of being alone. You're with other people. Everyone there is a lawyer. They get it. They get what being a lawyer is all about. Everyone there struggles with depression, so you don't have to tell them. They have a reference point, unlike people who've never had depression. And finally, those people really learn in a very deep and fundamental way that they're not alone, because that is one of the most awful parts of depression. I think when people get to that point, if it's carried too far, that's why suicide results. And lawyers have 6 times the rate of suicide than the general population, which is a very sad thing, but it's a very sobering thing. And I'm hoping that it motivates all of us to look into this issue and take action and get educated. Exercise, exercise, exercise. Why is that so important? Well, I'm not Oprah standing up here telling you to exercise, right? It's not a luxury. There have been many studies done, cutting-edge neuroscience, that demonstrates that exercise is a powerful antidote to mood disorders, particularly depression. One of the reasons why, without going into all the anatomy, is that they found by doing PET scans of the brain that people with depression have decreased blood flow to the frontal lobes of their brain. Frontal lobes are very important if you're a lawyer. It's your executive function, your thinking, your ability to reason, to plan, to make sense of experiences. They found that with vigorous exercise, blood flow increases to the frontal lobes. So that's why if you don't have depression, you exercise, you feel so much sharper, don't you? You feel so much better. With people with depression, all the more important, right? So it's not a luxury, it's not, well, that would be nice to do. It becomes a critical thing for someone with depression to do. Mindfulness meditation. This is, I believe, has spread through the country like wildfire. You see it in corporate America. There's programs about this being put on by IBM, by Coca-Cola, and by lawyer organizations around the country. Why is it so effective? The law can, because we're pulled in so many directions, fragment our lives. Okay? This centers you back. Deep breathing. When you're under this constant fight or flight kind of syndrome, your breathing becomes very shallow. All right? And you become caught in a perpetual cycle of fear, anxiety, and depression. Deep breathing, just like exercise, is a counterweight to all that. and drops you back into your body and out of your head, where most lawyers spend most of their time, right? Very powerful. Lawyers with Depression is a website I started 10 years ago because there wasn't one. And when I did it, shortly after I was diagnosed and in recovery, I went looking for a place to contribute an article, and I couldn't find one. And I was shocked because I knew about all these statistics. And I thought, there's websites for everything, dog shampoo, lawnmowers. There had to be one for this topic, and there wasn't, so I created one. And why I put it up here is because it's a way to get educated about anxiety, depression, mental health kinds of things. It includes resources. I blog about my experiences with depression as a lawyer. We have guest articles from around the country, from authors and experts on the topic. And there's depression in the news items that come up on this topic. So I welcome you and encourage you to visit that site. Now, my closing argument is this, and I'll keep it simple. I wanted to sum up in some way for you my visceral reaction to hearing hundreds of stories from around the country of young lawyers, older lawyers, judges, law students, about their experiences with depression. Okay. And what comes up over and over and over again is the low opinion they have of themselves because they struggle with this illness. Unfortunately, they often experience a negative reaction or negative statements from other people should they disclose this condition. They did a poll recently, and 50% of all Americans said that depression was a failure of willpower. 50%. So that's 50% of our country saying to that person in one form or another, and sometimes it's very nuanced, and sometimes it's very direct, that there's something wrong with you. What does that do? It drives the person deeper into a state of despair, maybe hopelessness, or maybe they stop or don't seek treatment at all. So what I say to them, speaking from my own experiences listening to these stories, is this. Christopher Reeve came to mind. And I don't know how many of you remember him, but he was in the 70s, the guy who played Superman on the big screen. Very handsome, like many of you gentlemen out there. He was this heroic figure on the screen. And tragically, sometime later, after playing Superman, he was in a terrible, tragic accident while riding a horse. He was an equestrian and broke his neck. He was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was once asked by a reporter, who better to ask than him, what is a hero? And he said, a hero is an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming odds. And I love that quote. I have it on a little card that I keep in my wallet. Why is it so important? What does it have to do with what we're talking about? In my view, this is what people are. I apply this to people with depression. And in particular, lawyers with depression, because that's who I'm speaking to today. So, these people find the strength to persevere. And make no mistake about it, depression or any other serious mental illness is something you have to have and reach down to find the strength to keep going. And a common myth is that, well, we're really talking about people with depression who are in mental institutions or on disability. No. Most people that I know with depression, including myself, are working people. Some of them, many of them, very high functioning. Judges, circuit court judges, appellate judges, trial judges, young lawyers, old lawyers. And these are people that get up every day, and find the strength within them to persevere, to keep going. And they endure in spite of overwhelming odds. And make no mistake about it, depression presents somebody with overwhelming odds. It's an enormous foe. It's a big, scary giant. It afflicts the legal profession 3 or more times that of the general public. And I hope one of the takeaways you have today, I think there was about 100 people here. If you plug in the numbers, 30% of the people here today, 30 people, were struggling with some form of depression. You yourself who are listening to this may be one of those people, or you know somebody who is struggling with depression. The chances are overwhelming that you do. So the takeaway I hope you have is that to remember that if you're one of those people suffering, that you are a hero. You are a hero. And that if you know somebody who you know has depression or might have depression, treat them like heroes. Okay? Thank you.
Erie County Bar Foundation started back in 1957 when a small group of friends came together to help a colleague in need. Today, it is specifically chartered to assist lawyers in times of personal and professional crisis that arise as a result of stress, anxiety, substance abuse, emotional distress, or other illnesses, such as cancer. During my 6 years on the board of directors, depressive illnesses became increasingly prevalent among the attorneys who came to the foundation for assistance. While every circumstance is unique and compelling, I can't recall a single recent case where depression didn't play a part. Our foundation is available to help in various ways, but what's most important in every case is the necessity for the lawyer to reach out and get help. There are endless resources readily available to those who may be suffering in silence. The foundation covers the cost of psychiatric evaluations, medication, counseling, all of the tools that a depressed individual needs to begin recovering from this debilitating illness. It's essential for lawyers to realize that it's actually a sign of strength, not weakness, to accept help to face these struggles head on. I applaud those who appear in this film for their courage in bringing this problem to light. If you or a colleague are struggling with depression or anxiety, please don't let professional pride prevent you from doing what it takes to get your life back. Outside of Erie County, lawyers throughout New York State and across the nation are fortunate to belong to a profession that makes resources available to help lawyers, judges, and law students. Lawyer assistance programs, originally organized to address alcoholism and substance abuse, now also provide assistance with depression, anxiety, and stress. They provide assessments and evaluations, as well as referrals to appropriate treatment settings. Here in New York State, these services are confidential and free. The lawyer assistance programs are a logical first step for lawyers seeking help with depression and other mental health concerns.
Law as a profession, I think, breeds depression.
I didn't know what depression was.
Depression, above all else, is a vicious circle.
being a judge is a very isolating experience.
As a woman, depression was different for me.
It stops your brain.
Why anyone would commit suicide.
I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face left on earth.
Joshua Wolfshank is the author of the acclaimed book, Lincoln's Melancholy: How Depression Fueled a Presidency to Greatness. We caught up with him in New York City and asked him to share with us his insights into Lincoln, the man, lawyer, and president, and how he struggled with depression.
Trying to describe Lincoln's story, I looked at the whole story from beginning to end, and I tried to look at what remained constant and what changed. What remained constant is that from his early 20s, melancholy was a big feature of his life, what we would today call depression. What changed, though, is that when he was in his early 20s and his mid-20s and early 30s, he often had something very much like what we would call major depression, where he was withdrawn. There were several periods where he didn't work. He talked about suicide. He often talked about how awful life was and how hard it was to bear, and he was very out with it in a typical way. And he would, if a modern clinician looked at him at this time, they would diagnose major depression.
Depression is a very funny thing. When I first sought treatment, I didn't know anything about chemical imbalances. I didn't know anything about the physiological causes of the problem.
Dr. Richard O'Connor is a therapist in New York City and has written extensively about depression. He is the author of the best-selling book, Undoing Depression: What Therapy Can't Teach You and Medication Can't Give You. We asked him to speak with us about depression and its role in our society and the legal profession.
Well, depression is officially, the textbook definition has to do with you have to have a depressed mood, or life doesn't bring, the ordinary activities don't bring to you the joy they normally do for a period of at least 2 weeks. And then there have to be a bunch of other symptoms like appetite slows down or increases, trouble sleeping is probably the most frequent one, trouble concentrating, trouble focusing, trouble with eating. Most people eat too much. Some people lose their appetite altogether, and trouble with sexual functioning. Those are all sort of aspects of depression. And there's a lot more informally that the textbook doesn't cover.
We traveled to Seattle, Washington to meet with Dr. Andrew Benjamin and Dr. David Dunner. We spoke with Dr. David Dunner, a Seattle psychiatrist and recognized authority on depression, about the impact of depression on the human brain.
How does depression affect the brain?
We know that depression has effects on the brain that we've begun to measure with imaging techniques in particular. For example, certain areas of the brain, the left prefrontal cortex, the left frontal part of the brain, tends to function differently in patients when they're depressed than when they're well. There are areas in the deep structures of the brain, particularly the hippocampus, which is a small structure in the brain, which shrinks in people who are depressed. And it's thought that the stress that occurs during depression causes an increase in a compound called cortisol. And the cortisol actually affects the hippocampus in the brain by causing cells to die. And when you get rid of the depression, when it's treated or when it's over, those cells can come back and hippocampus will again increase during treatment of depression.
Well, the World Bank and the World Health Organization commissioned a study about 3 years ago. They were looking for knowledge about where to spend their money best in terms of preventing disease. And I think to everybody's surprise, they found that depression was perhaps the second most costly disease that there is worldwide in terms of lost productivity, the cost of treatment, the effect on families and general social functioning, absenteeism at work. All these things grouped together mean it's more costly than AIDS, it's more costly than cancer, it's more costly than diabetes, it's more costly to the world than anything except heart disease. And they predict that depression will soon outstrip heart disease in terms of impact.
Andrew Sparkler is a Manhattan attorney and a 2005 graduate of Fordham Law School. We talked with him about his good friend and law school classmate, David Nee, who suffered from depression and killed himself in his third year at law school. Following David's death in 2005, he, along with David's family and friends, set up the Dabney Foundation in 2006. Andrew is the president of the foundation.
The type of person who goes to law school tends to be a motivated, intelligent type person. And I think that the weird thing about depression is that, or at least in Dave's case, these signs that he exhibited, these signs are, they're common. He didn't display sort of rare signs, you know, or weird, out there symptoms of depression. These are basic, you know, when your friend's not around a lot, you can't get in touch with him, he's drinking a lot, you know, these are like big warning signs, red flags, and we missed them. And we missed them because we didn't have the vocabulary, the emotional awareness to recognize this. And it's not a tough concept. You know, this isn't like patent law. You know, this is easy stuff. Easy stuff to recognize. And we just had no idea. And I think that's a hard thing when there's this sort of a group of people who are good at getting things done and good at figuring things out, and here's this, you know, here's this specter of depression that killed, you know, our friend, and, you know, we missed it.
Dr. Andy Benjamin, a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, obtained both a law and clinical psychology degree and currently counsels lawyers who struggle with depression. He was the lead researcher that conducted a study to determine just how prevalent depression was in law schools in this country.
So over 5 years of time, longitudinal data were collected on this particular law school. That was the first longitudinal study of law students, and I followed, I actually collected data on the students before they entered law school, throughout their attendance in law school, and then after law school. I actually followed 3 different classes so that we had cross-sectional data. And those data were very compelling. They showed that, that as much as a third of the law school were suffering from some serious psychopathology at any time. 19% of those young people were suffering from major depression. And it wouldn't take very long from entering law school for the depression to begin to develop.
To admit that you are depressed to yourself or to others, well, that's a weakness. And if you're in a bunch of, if you're in a Shark Tank of sort of these hyper-aggressive folks around you in this environment where it's very high stress, well, that's a weakness that you probably would be hesitant to expose. Because why would you fess up to anyone that you have this problem? And the fact of the matter is, many people in law school are depressed. Many law students are depressed. There's one study that says that 40% of law students have had an issue, a bout with depression by the time they graduate.
The law as a profession, I think, breeds depression. A lot of that has to do with the fact that your interactions with people are negative in nature. Add to that the stress, the mental strain, even the physical strain. All of that can trigger a depressive incident.
The Honorable Michael Miller is a retired family court judge from Rochester, New York, who served on the bench there for 10 years. We went to Rochester to talk with him about his own depression and depression's impact on the judiciary.
And it's because of the tension. It's an adversarial profession. It has become an overcrowded profession. It has become a profession where now you can advertise all you want. When I came in, you couldn't even put your name in bold type in the phone book.
My depression first hit when I was about 40 years old, or about 8 years ago. At the time, I had been litigating cases and had a very busy life as a lawyer. And I really didn't know what depression was. I started feeling very tired all the time, like cement was running through my veins. I found it difficult to concentrate and be organized at work. I had trouble sleeping. I'd often get up about 3 in the morning, even though I was very tired. I couldn't sleep. So what I usually did was drive to an all-night coffee shop and drink coffee, and me and my coffee would wait for the sun to come up, and then I would drive to work.
I should also say, in terms of attorneys, one of the major areas of effect is on the ability to think. Our ability to concentrate, to focus, to retain new information, to make decisions is all impacted severely by depression. So that and that of course just feeds the vicious circle. Depression, above all else, is a vicious circle. We can't stop doing the things that make us depressed because we don't know how to do anything different. In some cases, like with the changes that happen in thinking and cognition, we're not even possibly we're not even aware of those changes going on, but they have their effect on our success, on our lives, on our relationships.
It is very rarely talked about among judges. Being a judge is a very isolating experience. And a lot of times, my colleagues, they took the phrase, "In God we trust," which is before every bench in New York State, and they thought the God in that sentence was referring to them. Then nothing could go wrong. They were strong. If they went for help, I know judges who have paid their therapists in cash because they don't want any insurance to cover it, they don't want any paper trail. If they have ambitions for higher office or to get reelected, they're sure that if ever got out, it would ruin their chances for that.
But I think also that you have to look at the high stress load that lawyers carry. You know, the long hours, the mental discipline required, the loss of respect in the community, which I think hurts many people, the competition to get a good position and to get a good place in a good firm. Those things have all increased over the last 25 years dramatically. And I think they really have their impact on lawyers.
As a woman, I think depression was different for me, partly because of the role that society assigns to women. The first time I was really depressed and suicidal was when I was out of work. And the stress of not working really brought me down. I felt that my self-image and self-worth was tied up in my work. And when I wasn't able to get a job, I became despondent.
I got the call from my very good friend, Wynn Kelly, who was in my section of Fordham, and he said, you know, something about, I have terrible news. Dave killed himself. And it was just, you know, it's one of those things for me anyway, but it's really, it's like you were tased. I assume. I've never been tased. But, it's like it's so jarring. It stops your brain almost. It's not, again, everyone's experience is different, but for me, I didn't immediately start crying, and I didn't have 1,000,001 questions. It was just, it really was, like someone just, all sort of thought drained out of my head.
Why someone with depression would commit suicide? Why anyone would commit suicide? You have to understand that most people who are approaching suicide have been living in a terrible world for a while, months, years, a long time. They've been living in a world where they don't see anything good happening to them. They don't have any expectations of things changing for the better. They often feel that they're to blame themselves for things being as they are. In fact, most people, I think, when they're actually on the verge of suicide, have got themselves around to thinking that their loved ones and friends would be better off without them.
I do remember Dave's funeral. I will never forget it. It was profoundly saddening. Really, really uniquely upsetting sort of experience.
In terms of, helping with yourself with depression, I think that's an excellent idea. I think that most people with depression are not going to be cured by taking a pill or even by psychotherapy. I think that most people with depression really do have to learn how to help themselves. One of the first steps is recognizing that this is a disease and that you're not to blame for it. However, you're responsible for it. And so you have to start practicing good self-care. You have to invest in yourself like you think you're worth investing in. So you have to exercise, you have to eat right, you have to make sure that you get enough sleep at night. You have to become aware of how you treat the people around you and start being more considerate and more thoughtful and smiling more, because those things pay off and they'll start you feeling better too.
I developed the website Lawyers with Depression for law students, lawyers, and judges because I know from personal experience how isolating and lonely a condition depression can be for anybody, but especially for lawyers because of the stigma involved. And I went looking for a website a few years ago to see if there was one for depressed lawyers. I thought I might contribute an article about my own experiences. When I couldn't find one, I was shocked that I couldn't find one. I built one, and I put in there articles, podcasts, interviews, all kinds of resources that a lawyer suffering from depression could use. They could go in their office, close the door, and learn about depression and how they can cope with it.
Dr. Jamie Schiffner is a clinical psychologist from Buffalo, New York, who facilitates a depression support group for lawyers.
The group meets every 2 weeks, and we've developed some structures such as a ritual for how to open the group and some things that I think protect the confidentiality of the group, which I think is very important in helping it to feel safe and to be a good forum for these lawyers to find support from one another. Mainly what happens, it's not so much an advice giving that where anybody tells anybody else what to do, but it's much more so a place where somebody can talk about the stresses they face, the struggles with their depression, the successes they have in dealing with depression, and have colleagues who really understand, one, about depression, but also what it is to be a lawyer. And what's unique about this situation is that it's lawyers helping lawyers. It's people who know about their profession, and there is something in that fraternity or sorority of lawyers that is really quite unique to any profession.
The primary takeaway I have from the support group is the chance to listen to others who are similarly situated. I like to hear about how other people are developing skills and approaches to address depression and anxiety in their life. I have had the benefit of trying to be mindful of stress in my life and trying to prevent it from causing problems in my life, primarily depression. I treated with a psychologist about 10 years ago, and since that time I haven't used medication, I haven't treated with a psychologist. I didn't want my life to be defined by depression.
My spiritual life is very important to me. In the past few years, I've come to believe in a God who is personally interested in me and wants the best for me. And I realize that I can lessen my stress when I'm able to handle problems over to God and let Him take care of them, and I don't worry about them. Then I don't have to deal with that stress.
So much of the time when we train people up in law school and they begin their careers, they forsake their personal values. And I found that in large part, actually having people delineate what those values are, to ask them to act congruently with those values across various competencies, life competencies, is a really critical juncture in trying to figure out where their life isn't going well and what can be done about those aspects of the life that are not going well.
The main way that Lincoln took care of himself around his depression were with his own strategies of working hard and working increasingly for things that mattered to him, using humor as a way of deflecting the pain of the world and playing it in a different way. He was a great comic and humorist, and this is just a huge part of his life. And the third was poetry and sort of very severe articulations of gloom and its pain. Lincoln loved dark, lugubrious, romantic poetry, and he even wrote some of this poetry. One of his poems ends with this line, "I'm living in the tombs," about his communion with people who are already dead and gone. So, and you could say that those two things, the laughter and the humor, are opposite, but really they're both ways of engaging with the world around him and not hiding these feelings, but finding some constructive way to work with them.
I also think it's important for loved ones to get involved with a depressed lawyer in their recovery. And that would include family members, friends, colleagues, members of the Bar Association who are concerned about a lawyer who may be going through depression. The first thing they can do, of course, is become educated. Educated about what depression is, what the signs are, and to recognize that that person who may be in a lot of, maybe struggling a lot in their practice as a lawyer and in their personal life, can't go through this alone, can't recover on their own. That person needs really a team of people surrounding him or her to recover.
Loved ones often see, but they don't feel they have permission to comment. But they can see how you've been dragging yourself around. They can see that you're not enjoying yourself anymore. They can see that you have stopped jogging. They see that you've been going to too many doctor's appointments. They see that you're drinking more. All these kinds of things that are sort of early indicators of depression. And really one of the biggest pieces of news about depression is that we know that the earlier you get help, the better off you are, the better your chance of total recovery.
So the idea behind the Dabney Foundation is just to make people aware of depression and of the stigma that exists surrounding depression and of the particular stigma that exists surrounding depression in the legal community.
In total, from the time that I first started to see a psychologist and use medication, I treated my depression for a period of about 10 to 12 months. I haven't looked back since.
Abraham Lincoln was one of the great lawyers and, of course, one of the great leaders in American history and indeed in human civilization. And his lawyering prepared him for that leadership. He really was at heart a lawyer. He intended to go back to the law practice when he finished his presidency. So he was this enormously accomplished man, and at the same time, his whole life, he struggled with what his friends and colleagues referred to as a terrible melancholy.
And they can never give up hope. That's the last thing. Don't give up hope. I almost did. I mean, I contemplated suicide. I really did, Dan. But somehow I just hung on to a bare thread of hope. And sometimes that's all you can do. My dad used to tell me, Michael, when you reach the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. And that's what I was doing.
I wanted to give back to the legal community.
It's lawyers helping lawyers.
I didn't want my life to be defined by depression.
My spiritual life is important to me.
He was a great comic and humorist.
You have to invest in yourself.
I haven't looked back since.
And they can never give up hope.